Okay, well, I want to go ahead and kick off this session. My name is Jennifer Walsky, and I'm the Interim Faculty Director at Impact at Anderson. Thank you so much for joining us for our weekend movie preview with Heriseida Begaj-Viotti at Participant Media's Impact Producer and UCLA Anderson's Faculty Chairman and Deputy Dean of Academic Affairs, Professor Sanjay Sood. The focus of our discussion today is on the 2020 Academy Award-winning documentary, American Factory. American Factory documents the revitalization of one long-shuttered factory in Dayton, Ohio. The film provides a startling glimpse into the global economic realignment playing out in towns and cities across the country and in the world. Today's virtual session is co-sponsored by Impact at Anderson and the Center for Management of Enterprise and Media, Entertainment, and Sports, or affectionately known as MEMS, here within UCLA. We also welcome Participant Media. Participant Media has produced more than 100 feature and documentary films that collectively have earned, this is amazing, 74 Academy Award nominations. As a media company, Participant is dedicated to entertainment that inspires audiences to engage in positive social change. Participant is also a Jeff Skoll affiliated organization, as are Capricorn Investment Group and the Skoll Foundation. Very recently, the Skoll Foundation announced $100 million towards the testing and contact tracing of all those infected with COVID-19, as well as the procurement of much needed medical equipment to countries lacking the resources to do so themselves. And now let me introduce this afternoon's speakers. Heriseida Begaj-Viotti oversees impact campaigns at Participant Media, where she works across sectors with nonprofits, multinational companies, government agencies, foundations, and others to raise awareness and mobilize viewers around film and episodic content. She most recently led the campaign for American Factory, a documentary produced by Participant and the first project out of Higher Ground, President and Mrs. Obama's production company. Her previous campaign work also includes Alfonso Cuarón's Roma, which helped to create conditions to accelerate change for domestic workers in Mexico and in the US, and Ai Weiwei's Human Flow, which built awareness around the globe for the refugee crisis. Heriseida holds a BA in Political Science and a Master of International Affairs and Economic Development, both from Columbia University. It's also with pleasure today that I introduce Professor Sanjay Sood. Professor Sood is the Faculty Chairman and Deputy Dean of Academic Affairs at UCLA Anderson and a Professor of Marketing, as well as the founding Faculty Director of the UCLA MEMS. Professor Sood's research focuses on two areas, brand management and behavioral decision-making. In his classes, Sood looks at movies and brands going through the same direction as other products. Whereas Hollywood used to launch a new brand weekly, the trend is now towards brand franchises. Using psychological principles in his research, Sood examines how firms can best build, manage, and leverage strong brand names. This includes investigating what brand names mean to consumers, how to manage brand portfolios, how to protect brand names from becoming diluted over time, and how to cross geographical boundaries. He most recently investigated the multi-distribution strategies now employed in the film industry, much of which has occurred at an even more rapid pace with COVID-19. Sood holds an MBA from Kellogg and a PhD from Stanford University. Lastly, I want to remind you that if you want to ask questions throughout this session, please do use Slido with the hashtag #FactoryF, and we have the chance to not only post questions, but upvote questions as well as we go through today's session. Professor Sood?
Thanks, Jennifer. Welcome, Heriseida. Welcome to UCLA. It's really nice that you take the time today.
Good afternoon. I'm sorry we can't be in person, but hopefully soon.
Next best thing. We're all getting used to it.
Right. That's
so
right.
As we go through the conversation, the film was made before all this COVID-19 situation was happening, so we can kind of go back and forth according to how you feel comfortable. But the film's available on Netflix. I'm sure that most of the audience has seen it, if not everyone. Let's just talk about first starting off with the film showing the shutdown of factories, and at the time it was made, how would you characterize where the future of work is heading from the standpoint of globalization?
Yeah, so I don't know how many folks know this, but if you think about the life cycle of American Factory, it actually starts all the way back in 2008 after the massive global recession with the film that Julia and Steve, the directors on American Factory, made called The Last Truck, which followed the closing of a GM plant. So all the way back, Julia and Steve, who live in Dayton, Ohio, see themselves as citizens with cameras. They wanted to document what that experience looked like for workers. That plant closed. Years later, it was reopened as Fuyao. And what you see in American Factory is fast forward a few years, what happens to the experience of workers? How does globalization start to bring cultures, working styles, et cetera, together? And we took the film on a tour last year across the country where we were talking about future of work without the expectation that 3 months later, where we are now, we're asking ourselves both a very similar question about we're an interconnected world hit by another crisis similar to what started the story in the same place on a more massive level. But the question of how do we support workers during this time is still as relevant as ever.
And one of the really interesting parts of the film was the contrast between the workers in the US and the workers in China. I mean, there was so many things there that were pointed out in a relatively neutral fashion, where they're just kind of showing how the workplace is typically in America versus how it is typically in China. And in China, they are working 7 days a week. The factory is nonstop. There's concerns about safety in the US that don't seem to be equivalent in China, at least not at their plant. One quote that came out of the film from Fuyao's safety director, so that everybody at level will say that we really, really want to be safe, but safety doesn't pay the bills. So there is no kind of perspective or editorial taken by the filmmakers, Julia and Steve. Why was that neutral perspective so important?
I think the neutrality, and I don't want to speak for Julia and Steve, but the way that they've contextualized it is this is a very human micro lens of an issue that's playing out on a global scale in so many other places. What is happening at Fuyao in Dayton, Ohio is also happening in many other contexts. So instead of being prescriptive in what you should think about it, it's to take this massive issue of future of work, of globalization, put it into a human context where you see the personal experiences of these two groups, where if you think about on a values level, there are similar values of I want to provide for my family, I want to do this, but the way that those are approached is not the same between the two groups. So you as the viewer are left asking yourself questions like, who am I in this story that is also playing out in my hometown, in my company, in my society? And what do I think my role could be to help make a difference? And I think it's that neutrality that allows those questions to be asked and provides a way for every audience member to sort of see themselves in the story a little bit more.
And one of the ironic things in the film, and it's never been more relevant, is that many of the workers end up getting replaced by automation, right? So what do you think is going to be the impact of automation as we come out of the virus crisis?
One of the things that has struck me most about what we're seeing now is a lot of the workers, like the ones in American Factory, that have been invisible, that have been affected by the socioeconomic inequalities, are now the workers that we're deeming essential. The robots weren't ready to do the jobs that our essential frontline workers were doing. Those are real people. And as we think about reopening and rebuilding, we're left with the question of how do we best bolster those workers? Now, automation, I think, is still obviously going to be something that companies will think about. But alongside that are questions about how do we prepare and provide for workers? Is it through reskilling? Is it through retraining? What is it that we do to equip a core facet of our society to respond and have the opportunity to continue succeeding and providing in a new context, which may include, a push towards automation, more globalization, etc.
And during the course of the film, there were some politicians that are also kind of featured, and they make some remarks about unions and things that the owners from China didn't really want to hear in that same way.
The scissor scene, yes.
Yeah. So, what were Julie and Steve's, the filmmakers' perspective on handling these various stakeholders and yet providing kind of the true context for what was happening? I'm sure they got pushed.
So the way that they approached the filming process was, from the beginning, they wanted access and they wanted the freedom to tell the story as it unfolded and not influenced by any particular side. The way that that played out is essentially they had access to the factory as they needed it. So they were there and they almost became a part of the backdrop, where you see scenes where you think, how would they say this in front of the cameras? But the camera sort of melts in the back and you become comfortable with these filmmakers who want to tell that authentic story. And that's part of what you see in that scene. There are tensions when we talk about how to support and protect workers. And what you also see in that scene is something that we try to focus on in our impact work, which is the need to bridge the different perspectives and sectors' needs in order to move forward. So policy, labor, business, academia, everyone is affected and needs to be part of the way forward if it's going to be successful.
And so that's a very interesting comment, that the cameras are there and sometimes people may forget that they're being listened to. The same, I guess, would apply to the unions and the kind of union discussions that were happening. I remember there was one scene in the film where the Chinese manager is kind of looking at different employees, and he says he's friends with one of the American employees, but because that individual had been active with the union, they were planning on firing that individual within a couple of weeks. And sure enough, later in the film, a lot of the active members of the union were being phased out. Is that something that was a surprise in terms of the way that it was being so openly discussed?
I think that if you look at the conditions that workers across the country are faced with, if they are trying to have a voice, unions in some cases are one of the pathways to having that voice, having access to increased salary or benefits, etc. So you see in the film an example of what worker voice could look like and what the threats are against it. What we're not surprised by is the fact that workers all over the country are going to be asking, how is it that I can have a louder voice? And that could take the form of unions, it can take the form of worker councils or having workers on board of directors. You see in the film the tensions that exist, but the fundamental question of how do we solve for improving the experience and serving the needs of workers in a context like a company that also has profits to consider, that has all of these other needs that need to be met.
And it's never been more relevant with the unemployment numbers that keep skyrocketing, and we're trying to stay safe, but yet get the country back to work. So this is, exactly the topic that we're all concerned about today.
Yeah, you look at the data from just this morning where we're seeing unemployment at rates that haven't been quite this high since the Great Depression. What we also saw even before this was in 2018, there were more worker strikes since the 1980s. And it's not, you see the factory context, but this sort of question around how do we give workers a fighting chance is also being asked by tech workers, video game workers, students on campuses. And I think as we emerge from this, that question will remain. Companies are going to face financial constraints, but at the same time, is this an opportunity to rethink from a broader community perspective of how can business leaders work with employees, with policymakers, so that everyone in some way benefits, because it's intersectional. A workers, having to experience the adverse effects of unemployment certainly has socioeconomic effects as well. So I think if we start to move forward with that, it's not us versus them across any sector. This is all of us that are being affected in some way. What does the path look like then?
And if we can just kind of move to participant media, just broadly speaking, I think everybody is impressed and amazed that this small studio can do such important, impactful work over and over and over again.
It's fun.
Yeah. So what do you, how does participant think about any follow-up that might emerge from one of the social issues in any film, whether it's this one or any of the other films that you've done, in terms of trying to start a conversation, follow up on that conversation, more broadly speaking, in society?
Yeah, so participant all the way from the time it was founded by Jeff Skoll on the idea that you can have stories can help change the world. We see our role as how can we use culture, media, storytelling as a way to create the cultural conditions for the change that is happening in the world. We are storytellers, but we're not the ones on the front line of creating the change. So how can we help accelerate that work that is being done by the private, public sectors, NGOs, civil society, students, and how do we use our films and episodic content to create a common context for talking about things, for uniting people? So with American Factory, when we started, the thing that we heard first and foremost was labor does not want to talk to business, does not want to talk to academia, does not want to talk to policymakers. And we kind of thought, oh my gosh, we're not going to get anywhere. Right. And no one wants to talk to each other. But then we thought, okay, so here we are, we have a film. If we take the position of there's a story that we want to share with different members of the community who are invited to an experience that we designed, usually as a screening and then dinner conversations. We invited the different sectors, and what we were deliberate in doing was we arranged the seating such that at the same table there was labor and business and academia, all of the people that need to be talking to each other. And we had facilitators who didn't ask hard questions like, what do you think about robots taking over jobs? It was more of a personal lens of, what does this story remind you of? How do you use what you see on the screen, the same experience that everyone has had, as a starting point for that hard conversation? So you have a CEO sitting next to a rank and file factory worker over mac and cheese, talking about how their grandfathers were both part of the same local union. Their paths have differed, but then they start talking a little bit about, well, why don't you want your company to unionize? Or why is it that you feel it's so important to have XYZ? So it becomes a way to bridge divides. And our hope is that the conversations and these experiences are a starting point for connections that continue beyond just the life cycle of a film, but that are starting from a place of empathy and seeing an experience visually and relating it to it on an emotional level.
And Jennifer mentioned some of the success that Participant has had over the years. What's the process that you go through before you choose a subject matter to tackle? Are there specific topics that you're more interested than others, and how do you go about vetting those projects?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you say that because we actually don't look for content around specific issue areas. We operate very much like a traditional production company in that we're looking for the best stories out there told by the best storytellers. And where there is intersection with issues, we have a team that's dedicated to going out and learning as much as we can from experts from organizations about those issues to see how we can take the content, the platform and attention that it'll have to accelerate the work that they're doing. And we think about that work in three ways. One is inspiring through the content. Secondly, how do we empower the audience beyond the experience of just watching the content when there's those few moments between finishing the film and having to go and make dinner for the kids where you feel like I want to do something, but I don't know what. How do you answer that question? And how do we connect both within a given community, but also across using the content as a shared context and a shared language?
And with the kind of content that you produce, it seems like participant is interested in a lot more than just box office. So are there different ways that you use to measure success that you can share with us?
Yeah, so our metrics of success are informed by a few things. First and foremost, our work is always done in partnership with the organizations leading the work. So as we design our impact efforts, we're also asking, what are the needs that you're trying uh, to solve for? What does success look like on climate change or for domestic workers' rights or on this issue? So, for example, on Roma, a lot of the push initially was around visibility, but then there was a federal domestic workers bill of rights that was this policy vehicle to expand rights. There was a similar one in Mexico. So we had the U.S. and Mexico sort of oriented around both this changing the narrative around domestic workers, but also there's a policy framework. Then there was a tech platform that the National Domestic Workers Alliance was launching, where we could say, okay, this is launching. We need an uptick in employers using this. How can we put effort behind that? So you have a concrete way of, are we helping to do that through what means? With something like American Factory, it's tricky. We started off thinking, well, what are we going to measure? What do we know we can count? And sometimes you can't count things like just getting past that initial threshold of putting the right people in the room together. But what we then saw was what happened afterwards. So we did some surveys where we asked people about the impact that going to one of these experiences had. And in some cities, something close to 80% of participants said, I'm starting to think about this from a different perspective. Or we worked closely with Harvard Business School because they had a case study that's taught to all first-year students around Fuyao, actually. So we did a screening with them. We did a Q&A. They learned this case study. We're doing a follow-up case study that doesn't just look at the operational side, but now looks at the sort of more human worker perspective. So the fact that the film is now contributing to this complementary case around workers is pretty significant. So sometimes you rely on concrete metrics. Other times you look at the anecdotal and see what you're contributing.
I don't think there's any doubt that participants made a positive impact on the world. So,
Oh, well, I appreciate that. Well, and the one thing that, you know, we try to remind ourselves of is if you talk about impact in very real terms, it's very long term. So we're all just taking a crack at different things, and hopefully over time and through the use of culture, we can make a difference.
and if we kind of look at the context today where unfortunately theaters are going to take a while to open up, Does this kind of change the way that you look at the future about distribution? What's the shorter term viewpoint, and then the longer term prediction that you would have for the way that the film business is going to be in the short and long run?
Yeah, so not as someone who doesn't work on the film and creative side of things, I think about that question a lot from an impact perspective of if we're trying to create change using content as the way to inspire, what does this whole situation mean for us? And our teams have been scrambling around recent releases. We just released a film that was supposed to be theatrical on demand virtually called Slay the Dragon about gerrymandering. And one positive thing that you see there is that there is an opportunity to reach wider audiences because it is being made available in a format that is more accessible. Then the follow-up work that we do in terms of connecting people, in terms of having these conversations, suddenly everyone's just sitting at home. So the people who just watched in New York can talk to the people who watched in Wyoming. And it is a new opportunity in terms of connecting on a more massive scale and opening up access to more and more communities, which I think is core to a lot of the work that we do.
Okay, so this will be the last question from me, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Just everybody's talking about what they're watching, what they're binging, or what kind of recommendations do you have of what you've been watching, whether it's a participant project or any project that's currently of interest?
Well, on the participant front, I think that Slay the Dragon, if you're thinking about the election, if that's top of mind, highly recommend
Who's
that
not
one.
thinking about the election?
Right, who is not? And then I've been watching a lot of escapism, as I would call it. So I just finished a German TV show called Babylon Berlin. That is a period piece, but it sort of just gets me out of the mindset. And then if you're looking for very uplifting participant content, I would highly recommend Wonder or RBG if you're looking at the headlines this week and you're like rooting for RBG, then just be reminded how tough she is by watching that documentary.
Yeah, and when she just checked into the hospital again, I think we all took a breath, but that woman's amazing. She really is.
Right. I'm sure she'll be back to her push-ups in no time.
I bet so too. Okay, so let's move to questions from the participants here. So from Perry, is participant at work now producing something around the current situation? If so, what's the point of view being considered?
So that's a question I would defer to our content teams for, but I know that as they're looking forward, a lot of what they are considering in terms of the projects we invest in will include how are we reflecting what's happening in the world today.
Okay, this one is from Pranav. Participant is perfect at managing the continuum of highlighting and publicizing an issue through film, and then working with those actual NGOs and social enterprises. What was it like for this project, and how is the experience like overall when you're working on impact pieces?
The way that all of the experiences start is from a place of listening. So what we start every project with is called a listening tour. And we approach those conversations saying, hey, we're storytellers. We have this piece of content that deals with XYZ. We're trying to catch up and better understand what is happening in the field. So we spend a lot of time learning and then listening before we say, okay, here's how we think that we can help. Once we do that, we see our work as accelerating the work of partners. So the design of the impact campaigns is from a lens of what are their needs and how can we best serve them with our convening power, our content, the talent that might be associated, and then working closely and iterating as we go along. So when we started American Factory, as I said, the different sectors did not want to be in a room together. So we had to ride that out and then observe enough to figure out how is it that we as an outsider can help contribute to this impasse that we're seeing. And how can we design with storytelling and with the content at the center an experience that solves for this need that we're hearing about and seeing?
So when you're working on projects, do you have similar partners that you go to for follow through, or does it change depending upon the project every time?
Our goal is as much as possible to continue to collaborate with organizations. I think we want to more and more highlight longer term relationships. At the same time, we want to make sure that the organizations that are specifically focused on an issue area are given a platform, and those might be smaller. An organization that's working on gerrymandering is not the same as an organization that's working on PFAS chemicals. So we want to be intentional about those, but make sure that our partners know that we are still there for them and supporting their work in whatever ways we can.
Okay, so there's a question from a student. What was the experience like having someone with the cachet of President Obama becoming attached to this project? Because it was the first project that they backed in their foundation.
Well, it was really cool. I mean, the sort of reach and visibility that having Higher Ground, having the Obamas, having Netflix, which is a global platform attached to it, it certainly made our life a whole lot easier because everyone was curious about what story the Obamas wanted to tell. And if you watch the film, there's a 10-minute piece afterward, the conversation between the president and Mrs. Obama with Julia and Steve, where they express their philosophy on storytelling and how important it is to tell these narratives. So the fact that this aligned with a narrative that they wanted to share, I think it just added extra fuel and, of course, a little extra pressure to our work. But we're so grateful for that collaboration.
Would be cool. I would agree. So here's a question from another student. What role do business schools play in shaping the future of work to be more equitable? So you here with Anderson, you mentioned the work with HBS. How do you see us playing a role?
So not to insert ourselves in your curriculum, but if you would like to use American Factory, I think it's a great resource, and we have materials designed for it. When we started working with Harvard, it was a little bit before the film was released, so we hadn't seen the response to it yet. And then the film came out. We went to Boston, did a screening over finals week, which was fun, for about 500 students, business school students and other members of the community.
Wait, 500 students showed up in finals?
Yes, yes. We gave them food, so there was a little bit of bribing. What we expected was they're thinking about their role as future business leaders from a very tactical, operational lens. So we thought a lot of the questions would center around that. But what we also wanted to do in designing that event was bring in a labor activist. We had one of the directors there, and then we had faculty members. And that was intentional because we wanted them to see different perspectives. What we saw in the questions was no one asked an operational question. It was more centered around, I haven't considered how I'm benefiting or harming my workers as I think about this. So where we see the opportunity with students are the future of all of the systems that we're talking about. And there are traditional ways that our academic institutions teach certain concepts, but I think that's shifting. So with business schools, like with Anderson, if you bring in a film like American Factory, does it provide an opening so that students, as they move forward in business, can take into account needs that go beyond profit? And how do we supplement the skills that they're learning now to help them make those decisions and solve for the challenges, because there are going to be conflicts. But if we see this as an opportunity to prepare students, I think we'll go a long way.
Yeah, I'm glad you phrased it like that, because one of the changes that I've seen as a faculty member for almost 20 years now at UCLA is that the student body is really shifted in terms of the weight that they place on social impact. So
Right.
Jennifer's the interim director of the Social Impact Center. We have lots of students doing projects in the field that are related to impact. And I'll just give you an example. I think when I used to teach the core class, I used to ask students, if you were offered a job for $1 million to take over running Marlboro, the cigarette brand, how many of you would take that job? And I'd say, 10 years ago, 90% of the students would raise their hand. I'll take the job. It's a lot of money. And today, it's reversed. 90% of the students say they would not take the job because they don't want to work for
Wow,
a company like Marlboro. So it's really changed.
that's incredible.
Yeah, so MBAs are motivated by more things than just money these days, which is nice.
A good reminder to everyone. And I think if you look at, what came out of the Business Roundtable towards the end of last year, where they put out a letter sort of sharing this mentality of shifting from a shareholder prioritization to one of a stakeholder prioritization, and having that be reiterated at Davos, there within the business community, I think there is more thought being given to this transition. I don't want to be naive and forget the fact that we are living through extenuating circumstances that are going to challenge some of how those goals are operationalized. But at the same time, if we can continue to reinforce, particularly among students who, maybe in a few years they'll be in a position of power, to continue to take these other non solely profit driven needs into account, I think that is going to be key.
And you had mentioned in the session for the screening that you had done that you also had a labor activist on the panel. So can you give us some insight as to what that person's perspective was on the film and where he or she thought that things should go?
Yeah, the main reason why we wanted to have the balance in conversation was to showcase that, um, as a business school student, you're learning about the very tactical decisions that need to be made. But as someone who is thinking about putting the worker first, what are the other considerations that still affect that financial bottom line, but from a people focused perspective? So she spoke a lot about work that was happening to raise worker voice. And we want to be balanced in terms of saying unions are one example. There are other examples. What with each of these models of helping to create, to restore the compact between employers and workers, what are the challenges, sacrifices, opportunities? But I think that we wanted that narrative to come from someone who came from labor, not from anyone else sort of, speaking to it. We want to raise the authentic voices from all different spaces together so that we can start to build that dialogue.
Okay, so here's a question from Jennifer. How does participant choose to filter which films and subjects to back, and how is that made your role as an impact producer more nuanced and interesting?
Yeah, we are so lucky that we have content teams that are really good at what they do. Somehow they're able to almost predict issues that are going to be part of the zeitgeist years before. If you think about the life cycle of a film, sometimes you start shooting a film and it gets released 5 years later. And we're lucky in that, they tend to pick projects that hit right when they're supposed to, including American Factory. The way that we approach our work at Participant is also, our impact team is integrated in the process from the green light of the project. So as a company, when we make the decision of whether or not we'll invest in a project, we do, as one of the factors, consider the impact opportunity. And then we stay engaged throughout. So we'll talk to the filmmakers, we'll understand their perspectives, their desires for creating change, if that's part of their objectives, and then we'll build against that. So the content team will work their magic to give us this fantastic piece of content, and throughout that process, we'll be thinking about, okay, how do we best leverage this incredible piece of art and tie it to activist opportunities?
And so sometimes a participant has made a follow-up film. So like, for example, with an Inconvenient Truth, because that topic was so relevant, it really started a movement that got everybody concerned about the environment. This seems like a film that might also lead to a similar kind of, are there any plans for a follow-up or checking in a few years later as to what's been going on?
I think we're all curious. In many ways, American Factory is the follow-up to Last Truck. And
Yeah.
I'd be curious, 10 years from now, anything that we talk about today as far as predicting what will happen, probably may or may not. If I don't think that Julia and Steve would have thought that that GM plant would have been bought by a Chinese billionaire who came into Dayton, Ohio. But that's part of the beauty of storytelling, and we've stayed in touch with some of the workers who you see in the films, is to track their stories. And as far as a sequel, I mean, I haven't heard anything, but I think just watching how this plays out in that community and everywhere else will be great fodder for content, whether it's ours or someone else's.
Okay, so here's the next question. So how do you see Contagion, which came out in 2011, as part of the COVID narrative now? And what are you doing at Participant as you revisit some of these themes from the film?
Yeah, I have stayed away from rewatching Contagion the past few weeks, but other people have not. There's definitely an uptick in iTunes.
It's kind of
Um,
eerie how prescient that was.
yes, yes, I think so. First off, I think everyone at Participant feels really lucky to be part of an ecosystem of organizations founded by a visionary who, uh, among the few issues he focused on, pandemics was one of them. And Contagion and the work we did around that, was part of that history. So when we saw the conversations and needs when we first started to sort of quarantine, participants worked with the talent in the film to release a set of Contagion PSAs that were intended to be informative, and to share some of the main information that folks needed to know as everything was evolving quickly. So the content itself was still entertainment or a precautionary tale, however you viewed it as an audience, but our role became, how do we continue to leverage the attention that content is getting, the relationship with filmmakers, their desire to help highlight the most important information, work with some of the top scientists and doctors to make sure that information is right, and then leverage that star power to marry the two. And we thought that that was a good contribution that we could make early on to this situation.
Okay, so next question is from Matt. What has been your favorite campaign to work on, and why was that campaign so impactful to you? It's like choosing one of your children, right?
I know. I'll choose two. I mean, Roma was really fun because it was this beautiful masterpiece of art that then people got the message that we wanted them to get even before we had to deliberately put it out there, and that was really incredible. And to get to expand our work to Mexico was really fantastic. But American Factory is like still my newborn baby that I'm shepherding through life, and Julia and Steve, the two filmmakers, are inspiring in so many ways, including the fact that they really prioritized what this story could do for everyday people. And uh, I think our entire team learned so much about humility of talking to people who we as coastal dwellers, we usually forget about the needs and perspectives of people who whose experiences are not like our own. And the project really forced us to stop, not insert our viewpoints, listen, and then really figure out how we could be of service using the art form, and to have both the reach that we did with Higher Ground and Netflix and the support of Julia and Steve was really special.
And so with Roma in particular, that one with the Academy season, did you work on the Academy Awards campaign, and what was that like?
So it was really great to have the attention that I was getting around the award season be coupled with more and more conversations about, well, what is the film also speaking to from an issue perspective, and to be able to share that spotlight with some of our partners. So during award season, there was a week when there were 3 articles in the New York Times by the National Domestic Workers Alliance. When it came out, the president, the newly elected president of Mexico, hosted a screening at their equivalent to the White House, and started to talk about domestic workers. So the glitzy awards chatter that was happening was also this magnificent spotlight to elevate the issue, and that doesn't always happen, but it did in this case, and that's where the magic is.
Oh, so that's really unusual and really fantastic. They use that opportunity of being in the spotlight to highlight the issues even more.
Exactly.
Okay, so next question. This is from Adam. Based on the story you captured, what do you feel are going to be the most important lessons to be learned for companies in the years to come?
I think that's the million-dollar question. I think that what the film shows is that there is that compact between employers and workers is broken. And we, even before COVID, our economies and societies were facing pretty existential changes, including globalization, automation. That is just compounded now. What I think the film speaks to is how do you address the rift so there is no us versus them, but rather this shared mentality that in order for business, labor, academia to succeed, they have to start to see each other eye to eye. And there needs to be a shift in consciousness around how we value workers, a shift in consciousness around power, who holds power and in what respects, so that the sacrifices that are made, whether financial or otherwise, feel like they're contributing to a stronger, better economy and society. And one thing that we heard often in Detroit specifically from auto workers was when the crisis happened in 2008, the workers for the car companies were ready to make concessions because they had the pride of working at those companies for a long time, and they understood that there had to be collective sacrifice. And I think part of the tension that we've seen in the aftermath is that feeling of not seeing the reciprocation of those sacrifices that were made. So what that sort of shows is, if you boil down worker, company, whatever hat you want to put on, the needs that they each have, and also include the human perspective, how does that change the calculus? And I don't think we know the answer to that yet, but I think we need to keep reinforcing this question of how do we start to restore so that we're reimagining in a way that is beneficial to not just one group.
And as the workforce changes, And now with our high rates of unemployment, mental health is also becoming an issue. Did you see any of that as part of the project while it was going on, or was that yet to kind of manifest itself?
Yeah, we hadn't seen that as a result of COVID particularly as well. But I think what we did see was um, a lot of humility from people who were in difficult situations, and this sort of attitude of just wanting to feel seen and heard in the context of a lot of other things happening. So I think as we come out of this situation where workers are going to face really tough circumstances, and companies will too, I mean, across the board, I think there needs to be a lens of empathy that guides decision making, because it does have this crisis has repercussions on so many levels, mental health being one of them.
Okay, so here's a question from another student. What's a topic that you would highlight if you could pick an immediately green light?
Oh gosh. Ooh. That's fun.
Be careful of what you say,
hmm,
because you're going to get a lot of
I know.
scripts coming your way.
I know. I don't, oh gosh. I don't know. I would say something about young people and how on so many of the issues that I've worked on, young people are really picking up the mantle and doing some awesome stuff. I mean, Greta is the perfect example, but we had a film about Malala. There's the next generation gives me so much hope. So capturing that in any way we can is would be great.
Oh, that's interesting. So even for a film like American Factory, do you see a lot of young people kind of over-indexing?
Young people were really interested, and in fact, we've seen generally, but also amongst uh, teachers and students post COVID, a lot of people reaching out to us saying, "We want to host a screening." And students are, I think, hungry for change, and giving them a film. Who doesn't like to watch a film, right? It's better than reading a textbook. Is a great
Well, according to
way
my
to.
kids, black and white is out of the question.
Okay, well, okay, there you go. There, that's fair for them, I guess. But it's, you see that appetite because it's powerful, it's engaging, and it's a platform to talk and discuss and reimagine.
Okay, so here's a question from another student. Would you mind sharing any tips about balancing, facilitating conversations between different social classes and groups, and accelerating polarizing divided views across groups in the role of media?
Yeah. So a couple of things that we learned trying to do that. First, we listened to all of the groups individually. So before we decided to get everyone in a room, we tried to understand the sensitivities of why they weren't talking to one another in the first place. So understanding each side helped in designing an experience that would help to solve for that a little bit. The shared experience of the film, I think, was a great starting point. Um, Literally breaking bread together, that concept feels very old school, but the meal component, it was so simple. Sometimes it was sandwiches and soda, but bringing people around a table, literally doing something as disarming as just having a meal, it puts you in a different mindset than if you're in a boardroom or just sitting, in a different context talking to each other. So how do you
Breaks
help
down walls in
to.
a way.
Yeah, it breaks down walls. And then we saw our role as, we're not there to tell anyone what to do, but how can we identify people in the community who are neutral, who are trusted. um, in Louisville, Kentucky, that ended up being a local news anchor, who, everyone watches her show at 5 p.m. every day, and she's really popular across the board. So she moderated that event. So in communities, we try to sort of access who is that trusted messenger. And then making sure that the conversations don't start from the crux that you're trying to get to. We didn't start our conversations focused on globalization and automation. You start from that human experience, break down walls, and then allow people naturally, with some facilitation, to get to that place of starting to bridge the divides themselves.
Okay, so we have a question from Dina. What is the most important lesson you've learned in working on social impact films, and what advice do you have for someone who wants to work in this space?
The most important thing, as someone who comes from a policy global development background and loved data and talking about like this is the program that you put in place to solve for this need, is on so many of these big challenging issues, you need to start from an emotional place. So storytelling, film, TV shows, we relate to them on a completely different, non-analytical level that is an entry point for getting people to care about something, to align it with their values or their needs, and then hopefully to do something about it. So that's one thing I learned in making the transition from policy to media, was just the power of the emotional factor that art and content brings. I think the other thing that you always have to keep in mind in doing this work is listening and figuring out where to be a contributor to a space that you're entering, that where work has been happening for decades and will continue on for decades, and being honest about how you contribute right now and what you leave behind as far as what the partners are continuing to do. I would say my best advice for someone who's trying to do this is just go in with an attitude of innovating, of challenging the way that things are done. When we started on American Factory, we thought we had a different campaign in mind, and then we just started experimenting with different models. So use that emotional connection that the content will give you, and then figure out how you can most creatively chip away at the social issue that you're trying to deal with.
Okay, so last question. It's from a former student of mine, Diana. Hi, Diana. Good to see you or hear you. Do you want to give us some insight of how you landed at Participant? And, a lot of people would like to be like you, Heriseida. So just kind of tell us your journey.
Oh, that's
flattering. Close out with that.
So my journey. So I was born in Albania soon after the country democratized, and then my family and I were refugees when there was civil unrest in the late 90s there. So from an early age, I knew I wanted to work on global issues. And I went to school thinking that I would do that from an economics policy lens. And then just as life has it, where you think you've mapped out your future, I graduated and ended up moving to Los Angeles rather than going to DC or moving abroad. And I was thinking, well, what do I do with my background in social issues in a town that is so content driven? And I was really lucky in that the impact team at Participant was rearing up at that time, and they were looking for someone who sort of came from that public affairs work. And it was just this massive education around how you create change on a large scale, and how important it is to not just talk data, but talk to people about their emotions and their values, and allow them to experience something rather than telling or being prescriptive. So a mix of luck and life's, the lemons it throws at you and the lemonade you make out of it.
Yeah, from an Albanian refugee to Colombia to Participant. That's quite the American dream. Very inspirational story.
Yes, it is indeed. Thank you.
Okay, and we've run out of time, so I'll have Jay Tucker, the Executive Director of Memes, close us out. Jay?
Oh, thank you, Sanjay. Thank you, Heriseida, for a great,
Thank you so much.
provocative conversation. It was amazing. This was a great collaboration between the Center for Impact and the Center for Memes. Um, as you know, Anderson is doing its best to provide online what we typically do in person. For those of you who are interested, you can catch us next week online. We'll be interviewing S.E. Cupp, an on-air personality from CNN, on the 13th to talk about the role of media in times of crisis. Heidi Browning-Pearson, Chief Marketing Officer for the National Hockey League, former CMO for Pandora Music, on the 14th, to talk about sports and what's going on right now in that space. Please continue to engage with us. Please give us feedback about this session and all others. And thanks again for participating.
Thank you. Thank you, Heriseida.
Thanks so much. Happy Friday.